Hashtag how game music has evolved over 50 years. There is a moment, unique to gaming, where a piece of music becomes permanently fused to a memory. Maybe it was the haunting melody that played as you explored a dark dungeon. Maybe it was the pumping electronic beat that kicked in during a final boss fight. Maybe it was something so simple, so repetitive, that it somehow burrowed deep into your brain and never left. Game music does something that no other form of audio can quite replicate. It lives inside an interactive experience, and that makes it unforgettable in a way that even the greatest film scores cannot match. Today, we are going on a 50-year journey through the history of video game music, from the earliest electronic beeps to the full orchestral masterpieces that define modern gaming. This is not just a history of technology. This is a history of human creativity finding extraordinary ways to work within impossible limitations. Let us go back to the very beginning. The early 1970s gave us the first commercial video games, and the audio landscape was, to put it generously, minimal. Pong, released by Atari in 1972, produced nothing more than a simple beeping sound effect to confirm that the ball had made contact with a paddle. There was no music, no atmosphere, no sonic identity. The hardware simply could not support it. The technology of the era relied on what engineers called a single-channel sound chip, meaning the hardware could only produce one tone at a time. Within these extreme constraints, the concept of game music as we understand it today was essentially non-existent. But this was about to change very quickly. By the mid-1970s and moving into 1978, arcade cabinets began incorporating looping audio patterns. Space Invaders by Taito is a perfect and celebrated example. That iconic four-note descending loop, doom, 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 was not just background filler. It was a psychological tool that sped up as the enemies descended, creating a mounting tension that perfectly synchronized with gameplay. This was a pivotal moment in game audio design. Composers and sound engineers began to understand that music was not decoration. It was a mechanical element of the experience itself. The early 1980s brought the golden age of arcades, and with it came more sophisticated sound hardware. Games like Pac-Man introduced brief melodic jingles with recognizable character and personality. Donkey Kong gave players upbeat, almost whimsical tunes that contrasted brilliantly with the chaos on screen. But the real revolution came in 1985, when Nintendo released the Famicom in Japan and the Nintendo Entertainment System in North America. The NES sound chip, officially known as the Rico 2A03, supported 5 audio channels simultaneously. 2 pulse wave channels, 1 triangle wave channel, 1 noise channel, and 1 delta modulation channel for basic sample playback. 5 channels sounds modest, but in the hands of a gifted composer, it was a universe of possibility. Koji Kondo is the name that defines this era. His compositions for Super Mario Bros. In 1985 remain among the most recognized pieces of music ever created. The overworld theme, with its syncopated, bouncy rhythm, communicated joy, movement, and adventure through nothing but carefully arranged electronic tones. It was not trying to sound like a real instrument. It sounded like exactly what it was, something entirely new. Kondo followed this with the Legend of Zelda soundtrack the same year, proving he could shift from playful to heroic and mysterious depending on the emotional requirement. These were not just catchy songs. They were precisely engineered emotional delivery systems, and they worked with clockwork efficiency. Moving into the late 1980s and early 1990s, 2 hardware platforms pushed chiptune composition to its absolute peak. The Sega Genesis used a Yamaha FM synthesis chip, which produced a sharper, more metallic sound compared to the warmer NES tones. This gave the Genesis a distinctive sonic identity that composers like Yuzo Koshiro exploited brilliantly. His work on Streets of Rage 2 in 1992 produced club-ready electronic music that genuinely belonged in a nightclub, not just a video game. Meanwhile, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System introduced the Sony SPC 700 sound chip, which supported 8 channels of sampled audio. Composers could now use recorded instrument samples, meaning strings could sound like real strings and choirs could sound like actual human voices. Composers like Yasunori Mitsuda and Nobuo Uematsu flourished under these conditions. Nobuo Uematsu's work on the Final Fantasy series throughout this era represents perhaps the most ambitious musical storytelling in gaming history. The Final Fantasy VI soundtrack from 1994 contained over 40 individual tracks, including operatic sequences that genuinely moved players to tears. This was a 16-bit console producing emotional experiences that rivaled cinema. Uematsu was not working within constraints.
He was transcending them entirely through pure compositional genius.
The mid-1990s brought the transition to CD-based media, and this changed everything. When Sony released the PlayStation in 1994, game developers suddenly had access to hundreds of megabytes of storage instead of tiny cartridge chips.
This meant one crucial thing: real audio recordings could be streamed directly from the disc. Games could now feature full orchestral recordings, licensed pop songs, and studio-quality productions that were completely indistinguishable from commercial music releases. The gap between game music and mainstream music began to close dramatically. The impact was immediately visible. Games like Wipeout in 1995 featured actual licensed tracks from electronic artists like the Chemical Brothers and Leftfield. Gran Turismo in 1997 brought in a curated selection of real music that matched the aesthetic perfectly. And on the cinematic side, composers like Michael Giacchino were beginning their careers doing adaptive scores for games that used full orchestral recordings to create film-quality emotional experiences. The PlayStation era proved that game music had graduated from a technical novelty to a genuine art form worthy of serious critical attention. The early 2000s introduced another layer of sophistication: adaptive music systems. Traditional game music simply looped in the background regardless of what was happening in the game. Adaptive music, however, responded dynamically to gameplay events. The iMuse system, developed by LucasArts in the early 1990s, was a pioneering example, but it became far more sophisticated as processing power increased. Games like Halo Combat Evolved in 2001 used a dynamic scoring system where Martin O'Donnell's orchestral and choral composition shifted seamlessly between exploration layers and combat layers depending on enemy proximity. The Gregorian choral elements became instantly iconic and demonstrated that game music could carry the same cultural weight as a Hollywood blockbuster score. Throughout the 2000s, open-world games introduced an entirely new compositional challenge. When players can explore freely and unpredictably, how do you write music that always feels appropriate? Composers like Jeremy Soule solved this brilliantly. His score for The Elder Scrolls IV, Oblivion in 2006 and later Skyrim in 2011 used layered ambient compositions that could breathe and expand over long uninterrupted passages of exploration. The main Skyrim theme, with its thunderous Nordic choir chanting in an invented language, became one of the most recognized musical moments in gaming history and demonstrated that game music had fully arrived as a cultural institution. The 2010s saw game music begin receiving the mainstream recognition it had long deserved. Live orchestral concerts dedicated entirely to game music began selling out major venues worldwide. The video games live concert series performed in over 40 countries. Composers like Yoko Shimomura, whose work on the Kingdom Hearts series blends orchestral and jazz influences with breathtaking skill, began receiving widespread critical acclaim outside of gaming communities entirely. Streaming platforms emerged and players discovered that game soundtracks were genuinely excellent listening material independent of the games themselves. Modern game music in the 2020s operates at a level of technical and artistic sophistication that would be completely unrecognizable to the pioneers of the 1970s. Elden Ring's score, composed by Tsukasa Sagi and featuring contributions from the beloved Yuka Kitamura, uses a full live orchestra with a dark, majestic quality that rivals the greatest film scores of the modern era. Red Dead Redemption 2 features an original Western folk and ambient score by Woody Jackson and a collection of original songs that feel genuinely authentic to the setting, blurring the line between game soundtrack and standalone musical work.